Thanks to Michael and thanks to the school and for inviting me, and thanks to Brian for shuttling me around today and giving me the lay of the land. I'm going to talk about our practices, as Michael alluded to. But first, a quick anecdote. The last time I was in Columbus I was driving back from WashU to Boston and stopped, maybe it was a week after graduation, and stopped in Columbus because the parents of one of my closest friends from college, one of the best men at my wedding, lived here. So I stopped here, and Dick and Jane are here tonight, and I'm guessing just by simply standing here, I've far exceeded their expectations based on what they knew of me in college. So and I wanted to just thank them for coming. They were my first introduction to Columbus, and it's very nice to be back. I wanted to talk about a few themes that run through our practice. And in some ways, it's going to create a structure for this lecture. Now, the structure, maybe it's a little manufactured, but I think we're going to go with it for tonight. The themes are convention, starting a firm in a way conventionally, proaction, starting our firm with proactivity, reaction, and then most recently, kind of recovery. Our firm was formed in 1990, Jared and my collaboration was started in 1994. We were going to school together in St. Louis, and over a keg of beer, we would talk about how we would start a firm. We would start a firm. It was all very naive. So I moved to New York City. Jared finished school about a year after me. And we started doing work together. And our teachers in graduate school we had a lot of Spaniards and Argentines. That sounds really specific, but that's true. We had a lot of Spaniards and Argentines, and they were all building a lot of buildings at the time. It was one of the most inspirational things about school, was learning about architecture, but learning about the building of architecture. And we felt like when we started working together, we wanted to build things. Without any kind of awareness of how much older you have to be to actually build things. So when we got to New York City, we decided we would do some work together, and I found a competition on a visit to a wedding in San Francisco for Federal Plaza in San Francisco. It was just an ideas competition run by the Museum of Modern Art, and it said on the last page, they will build this project, or they intend to build this project. I don't think it said they'll build this project. I think it said, we reserve the right to, some legal language that said, maybe we'll build it someday if, you're lucky. So we entered the competition, and it goes in some ways to this picture of Richard Dreyfuss from Close Encounters, who stared at his kind of mashed potatoes on his plate of Devil's Tower, and he just looked at it and he says, this means something. And that was kind of what we felt like architecture was. It was kind of a pile of mashed potatoes that meant something. And so when we found a competition where they were going to build it, we would have the chance to test an idea and then make it. We worked kind of after hours. These are Beavis and Butthead. I realize that over the years that this is no longer that relevant to students now, and I have to explain who these people are. It's not a picture of Jared and me, though some people have thought it was. We entered the competition. We worked on it in nights at Starbucks before the dawn of the computer age to date ourselves. And we got a call one day from Aaron Betsky, who was the director of the San Francisco Museum, the curator of architecture at SF MoMA, that we had won the competition and he wanted to put our work in an exhibition at the museum. We didn't get the call because we were sitting in front of a computer playing a Beavis and Butthead video game. So that's where we were at the time when we won this competition. And that's true. And the competition entry is on the left, and the actual project, which we were commissioned to design for construction, is on the right. And so our practice started in a way, very luckily, naive student, post-student, graduate students entering a competition, which is a very typical thing for students who've just finished with no work to do. We happened to win the competition, and they built it. So in some ways, an unconventional start to a very conventional effort. And then from there, though, the firm went kind of backwards. And it went backwards because young people don't have the experience to build architecture. There's a reason why young people are not hired to design large projects. It's because we don't know how things go together so well. It's because we don't know what we're doing so well. We have to learn by making things. And so we finished this large project, and then from there it was kind of back to the more conventional practice of building for friends, doing bathrooms, doing some kitchens, all the while being frustrated as hell by the fact that we had done this big project, but we weren't being given other work to do like it was some sort of divine right. So there was a little bit of naivete, a little bit of frustration, but also a lot of eagerness to kind of continue to build. So this is the house of my parents. This is the house I grew up in, and we were charged with adding to it. So there was a lesson here in trying to figure out how to convince your parents to do something that was a little bit off the wall. So we showed them enormous topiaries and large concrete blocks, and they finally settled on a kind of a zinc extrusion of a colonial house. So we learned how to I don't think deceive clients, but they're my parents. But we learned how to create a relationship where we could explain things and then settle on something that was architecturally intriguing, where the client fully understood all the implications of the design. And then one of the more complicated projects, this is Paul Rudolph. And this is one of the kind of an unconventional project, but done for a client and designed in a New York City kind of conventional manner. Paul Rudolph's home on Beekman Place is very famous. And Paul Rudolph's home on Beekman Place was purchased after 9/11, or before 9/11, after Rudolph's death by a private client who made some minor renovations and then sold it after 9/11 to our client. Our client, and if you guys don't know this project, it's a really, really crazy space. It's something like 23 different horizontal planes. It was Rudolph's own home and his laboratory. It is a really, really wild, vertiginous kind of place where even after having gone in 25, 30 times, I still kind of would trip over things because there were holes in the floor and glass planes. We were hired by an architect, and this is the space before we inherited it. We were hired by the owner who had hired an architect and then fired the architect after they had demolished a good portion of the interiors of the space. That's a little atypical, but in any case, the project was still a very typical interior renovation for New York City. It was taking a shell of a space and putting new things in and restoring it and working with the technical aspects of it to make it actually code compliant and work as a piece of architecture. So on the left is the Esto photograph of the space, and on the right is how we walked in. Same thing here. What we knew of, because it had been published numerous times, and what we saw when we walked in. Rudolph's bedroom, and Rudolph's bedroom on the right as we walked into it. Rudolph's bathroom is right behind that bed, and it was originally over the kitchen and was made of glass. So there was a glass bathtub that was right on top of the kitchen. That was gone. So for us, there was a big dilemma. Do we take the project? How are we seen as either shepherds of or destroyers of this really iconic space? A project, again, typical for New York, atypical in its intention. It was the first project where we used computers to visualize. We couldn't draw this space. It was impossible to draw in plan because any plan showed a series of horizontal planes. It was very hard to draw in section because Rudolph's section was not ruling, and it was impossible to measure this place. So we had to use the computer to design this, and this was really our first foray into using the computer to model. We had always drawn things by hand. We had always built models and constructed perspectives, and so this was a chance for us to kind of figure things out. Then there was the technical aspect. There were sprinklers that had to go into the space. There was new air conditioning. There was lighting. And there was also the kind of restoration and also intervention into a place that had been destroyed. We were nervous about taking it on because we didn't know how certain New York architects would react, if they would, in some ways, kind of blame us for what had happened to the place, even though we inherited it in a kind of destroyed condition. And this is where it ended up. It's very hard to explain where you are in this apartment by photograph. This is the entry. The hierarchies are almost non-existent, other than the main space. On the left was the rendering. On the top left is the rendering that we proposed to the owner, and on the right is the actual construction. The elevator for this building is about 3 feet by 2.5 feet, and everything had to be fabricated like IKEA furniture is. where it was brought in pieces, it was put together, it was then disassembled, taken off site and finished, and then brought back to the site in pieces, and then reassembled in site. So it was almost a pretty wild millwork project in its own way. And these are the type of spaces that you get. Again, it looks atypical, but the project was about building and construction. It was about how to work in a compact space in New York City and make a piece of architecture. Again, the rendering on the left was in process. The rendering on the right is, or the photograph on the right is finished. The owner didn't even know who Rudolph was when he purchased this apartment. That was kind of the amazing thing. He had no idea. He thought it was weird and cool. So he bought it. And then he wrecked it. And then he fixed it. This was the replacement of the glass tub. He did not want to put back a glass tub over his kitchen. So we played with reflectivity, we played with transparency. This is a two-way mirror. There's a shade that comes down between the bedroom where the flowers are and the tub, and the sink acts kind of like a fountain. Again, very muted palette. We were trying to kind of evoke Rudolph, and in some ways it sounds hokey, but be true to Rudolph. We explored all the details that had been there previously. We looked through drawings whatever drawings we could find. The issue with this place was that Rudolph had not drawn it. He just let it be built as he lived there. And when we pulled some of the pieces off the wall that had not yet been demolished, we found handwritten notes by Rudolph which said something like, one of them was, melamine everything. That was the note, is that he was telling his employees they just put melamine everywhere. And that's the kind of way this project was built. So there was very little documentation for us. It was never really filed with the Department of Buildings. It was never really up to snuff, up to code. The railings were to my knees and are very dangerous. We had to replace those. So that kind of, I think, explains a little bit about the kind of conventional aspect of the practice. Now, as I alluded to before, we were frustrated by the fact that clients wouldn't hire us because we were so young. So we just decided that it was really time to eliminate the client. In Robert Altman's movie, The Player, Tim Robbins plays a studio executive, and he kills a writer, I guess, in the first third of the movie, and it's kind of a not so light swipe at the studio system, where the writer, Michael Tolkien, who wrote the movie, is saying that studios effectively kill the writer in the process of making a movie in the interest of doing business. And in some ways, our next step was to kind of eliminate the client. So this was the parallel for us, was that the only way to build projects and to keep going quickly was to become our own client. So this series of projects relates to that. In a moment of serendipity, Jared was standing at a Kinko's and saw that the guys next to him were holding a developer's kind of pro forma and a project binder about a piece of building. This was in 2002. So this was about 3 years after we had kind of started really fully practicing. And he started talking to them, and it turns out they were developers, and they had not done anything, but they owned a piece of property, and they just hit it off in the line at Kinko's. Turns out that the city was running an RFP. They were selling non-tax generating pieces of land in East New York, which is a very rough section of Brooklyn, and selling them for very low fees to developers who would then build houses, affordable housing with a lottery system with set-asides and income caps. And so we decided that we would apply for some of these lots, and we mucked it up by adding 3 other architects to the team. So we had no development experience. We were acting as developers. We had very little built architecture experience, but we were going to be the architects. And this project had a very strict budget, and so we asked 3 other architects to all design houses. It was a complete recipe. It was again, another example of total naivete in the interest of making architecture. We somehow got awarded the pieces of land and made this a kind of a collaborative project in East New York. So this is the kind of territory that you see. And we worked with a firm called Architecture Research Office, Lewis Suramaki Lewis, you guys may know these people, and Briggs Knowles. We were all young, we were all kind of interested in building in the city and of like mind. So we worked on a charrette. We parceled out the lots to each of the architects. Each architect got a building. And we developed a series of plans and a palette of materials so that in the interest of construction, because we were the developers, we were actually at risk in this case. We weren't just designing for somebody else. We had to make the project on time. We had to make the project on budget. We developed a series of details where every building, regardless of how it looked, would be built the same way. And so the lots are spread around a corner in East New York. And this is what resulted. There were actually ended up being 5 homes, and every detail is the same. There was a stoop building, which you can see on the corner, and then there was a slab-on-grade building. And the only way to convince a contractor that they were going to build 5 buildings by 4 architects for about $100 a square foot was to provide them with really, really smart drawings. And I think that this project was kind of proof to the builder, and in fact to us, that you could do something that was different, whether it's interesting or nice looking, that's subjective. You could do something that was different, that was still responsible housing, that added identity. And this was a very important part of this project, was that in East New York, and in the city's program, what you end up with is developer builders, not developer architects. So you end up with developer builders who have the same plans in their file cabinet. They know if a lot is 20 feet wide, if a lot is 25 feet wide, or if it's a semi-detached lot, et cetera, and they build the same kind of houses. So you would see around the corner 7 houses all in a row, they all look the same. Then you would turn the corner, you'd see the same houses repeated again with no sense of identity. So someone could get home and say, where do you live? Like, I live in the 3rd one or the 4th one. I can't, I know that's my house, that's my car. And we wanted to create an identity so that someone could say, that's my house looks like this. And this is, again, what resulted. It went through the city, it went very successfully. We had about 1,600 applications for 9 houses, and that has nothing to do with the architecture, that just has everything to do with the desire and the need for affordable housing in New York City. In this case, just something as simple as turning the corrugation changes the color of the house. The house on the right is ARO's, and the house on the left was ours. And these are the owners on the ribbon cutting. Again, income maximums, set-asides for civil servants. And this is a project that took about 5 years of time to get through. From the time we were awarded the lots to the time we finished, it was about 5 years. Another naive moment that resulted in something interesting. Our office needed furniture. So we looked at furniture, we looked at kit of parts, off-the-shelf table legs. We looked everywhere. We couldn't find anything we liked because we're architects, so we don't like anything. So we decided that we would make it ourselves. We figured that we couldn't spend $40,000 on Vitra or Knoll furniture. We didn't like what was from IKEA. We didn't like what was online, so we would just design something and we'd make it. So we bought a CNC router for a couple $1,000. And then we hired somebody to run the CNC router. And then we spent like 7 months designing desks. And about a year later, we ended up with a desk. And so I think we spent about twice what we would have spent to Vitra or Knoll, and we waited a year. But we developed a table that we still use and which we actually love. And we called the table Jack, and it was a kind of a test in learning new fabrication methods, making ourselves the client in a way. We came up with a system that was in some ways about efficiency, even though the process was so damn inefficient. We milled these table legs, we tested sand casting, we tested milling aluminum, and we finally found a place in Pennsylvania after we designed this that told us that the most efficient way to do it was to cast aluminum. In the process of trying to figure out what we could do for a budget, and we still had a budget even though we were basically spending money out the door on our staff who was running the CNC machine, we had a budget for how much we could afford to make the pieces out of. And the pieces ended up being one piece that married it to itself. So you have a half a leg, effectively, which marries to the same exact piece with a simple screw. And then they get connected. And that becomes the table leg. And then you can make more connectors. We have not made more connectors because we didn't have the time or the money. But you can make a connector that's a kind of a tripartite connector that will connect them, or whatever you want to do. And this becomes a system of how to make table legs. So we called it Jack because it kind of looks like a person, but it also looks like jacks. And this is the desk. At the time also, we let every employee design their own desktop. So everyone was able to carve out holes where they wanted, do what they wanted to put iPods or pens or pencils where they wanted, and it became a little bit of a competition. So this was one of our associates' desks. And it's a nice landscape, and we realize now that the iPod no longer looks like that. So someone's using his desk. He moved to Minnesota, and someone else is using it, but I don't think they're using it for an iPod. Okay, so I'm going to go backwards a little bit on the whole kill the client kind of narrative. This is a project that Jared actually put a deal together for the real estate, and it's a project in Chelsea, and it's a very tricky site surrounding a gas station, which is this L. So as we developed experience on the developer side, it gave us a kind of an entree into the development world, meeting people, and it also gave us some experience on knowing how developers think and how buildings get built in New York City. So Jared was able to parlay that kind of knowledge into a connected deal between a developer and a landowner with the stipulation that we would be able to design the building. And this is the project that resulted. It's an L-shaped site in Chelsea. It's a very tricky site. It was one of the first sites the construction started on before the High Line was really complete. If you guys know the High Line Park in New York City that runs from the West Village up eventually to the Hudson Yards. And this site was kind of a test for new zoning. And so we had to kind of parse out the zoning in a way to make a very tough site work for a developer. And in this case, to move quickly, is that we came up with a single core which served two sides of the building, an apartment facing 10th Avenue and an apartment facing west towards the Hudson and over the High Line. Now, developers like space that costs more. They want to sell it for the most. So that, in some ways, also drove form in that the building begins to kind of billow. And as we looked at the High Line and we thought of the trains that used to travel along the High Line, which was an old commercial train track that served buildings in West Chelsea and Manhattan, we looked at the cloud of the train and the imagery of the kind of dark to light cloud and how a building would kind of billow out, which also married the idea of expensive real estate to architecture. So the building became wrapped in the cloud, and the building was shaped in some ways like a billowing cloud. And the solution was to create an irregular facade with a wrapper of stainless steel that had an imprint of a cloud on it. This was a mock-up of the paneling, a diamond pattern made of the image of a train cloud that was turned into a turret punch set of dies. So it's basically like an enormous electric typewriter. And that pattern was mapped across panels on the facade. This was the kind of the fabrication drawing that went to the CNC puncher to make each panel. So each panel is, or for the most part, each panel is unique. These are construction photos. The building actually hit a wall. The developer didn't finish on time, and it sat kind of stagnant for a long time, and they're just now finishing it. They got hit by the market, the recession. So these photographs were taken over 2 years ago, and the building is now finished. But you can see the pattern, and this is taken from the High Line. And the pattern kind of adds a luster to the building. It also it's a very bright building. And has been the subject of a number of blog posts in New York City about how much it focuses light, which a lot of buildings do, but the metal ones do it better. That's the view from the High Line. And then going from there to this project. And this project was the kind of first foray into architecture and development as one. So no collaborators. Jared acted as the developer, and our firm acted as the architect. And it's kind of, this is the New York black and white cookie. It's another building in Chelsea at 18th Street and 10th Avenue, just across the High Line across 10th Avenue from the High Line. So this is the High Line. The building I just showed you previously was up here on this L-shaped site. And this building is on the site of what were two just small, one was a photography studio and just a garage. This is Frank Gehry's IAC building. And next door to our building, when we started designing, there were plans for this building by a New York architect named Audrey Matlock. And so this building was part of the actual context before we started working. We knew about this project. They had started foundations. So we knew it was going to be next to our site, even though our site looked like that at the time. And so there was a little bit of kind of, I guess, engagement with the future without knowing exactly whether the building was going to look like this. And it kind of does look like this. It's quite a nice building. So we studied, as developer architects, it was, again, there's this kind of cynical attitude that you maximize square feet. Because every foot that you sell in this neighborhood is worth $1,000. Every foot is $1,000. So if you leave 100 feet somewhere in the ether, you just cost the developer $100,000. If you are bad enough to leave 1,000 square feet somewhere where you shouldn't have it, you just cost someone $1 million. So there's a lot of pressure on the architecture, and there's a lot of limitation from the zoning. And in New York City, there is a very strange thing called a permitted obstruction, which is itself kind of a contradiction. A permitted obstruction is a piece of building which is allowed to be in a place that it's not allowed to be in, if that makes any sense. In this case, what New York City calls a dormer is a piece of structure that is built in the setback, the street setback of a project. So at 85 feet in this building, there's a setback required by the zoning code. And if you know of Hugh Ferris's drawings, The Metropolis for Tomorrow, those drawings show the older New York City zoning code in its most kind of idealized fashion and beautiful drawings. Those codes, for the most part, still apply, and you can draw those, you have to draw those exact kind of drawings for the Department of Buildings. In this case, there was a permitted obstruction allowed in the setback, and it's called a dormer. It looks nothing like a dormer, and it's what this piece is, right here. So you have an 85-foot setback, but you're allowed to fill it up with something, and the rules about how you're able to fill it up have a specific relationship to geometry and the coverage of that setback. And so there are architects who fight this, and there are architects who don't fight this. In this case, we just, because it was the development side, things running the show in a way, but like there was no way to fight this. Every foot that we tried to architect out of the project was lost money. So we just said, let's figure out how to make this architecture happen within the constraints of the city code. And so we really just drew that, and we kept it simple, and the building became a kind of series of interlocks that really articulated and showed off the fact that there was this piece of zoning code. And so that's the building as it was built, and it's single floor apartments, and it really just articulates the zoning code. And it becomes a black and white object, nested pieces together. In order to deal with construction, we worked with a company called Front that does really, really amazing facade engineering, and I recommend that you guys as students all look at Front's work. They're located in New York City, and they've done a lot of work with Rem Koolhaas and Sana, and they do a lot of, they're architects, founded by architects, and they do facade engineering and design. And what they did was help us figure out a way to make these cinematic openings, very large-scale windows, and also figured out a way to manufacture this building in pieces such that they could fabricate wall panels and then hoist them in place on site. The building was wrapped in about 14 days. So glass was fabricated in China. The window pieces were brought to Long Island, where a company called Island Construction built fully insulated wall panels about 50 feet in length, and then brought them in on flatbed trucks into the city, and with a crane lifted each of these pieces up into place. And so in about 2 to 2.5 weeks' time, the building went from a shell of concrete, plank, and steel to a fully enclosed building. Those windows are about 6 feet tall by 13 feet long. It was about the largest expanse of glass that the company was able to produce. I'm praying that they don't break. That's a view of the building from the High Line. And again, because we were working as the architects, the designers, we were able to work with cabinet makers to design all the kitchens and bathrooms. And so we're able to control the design from start to finish and from outside to inside. And it was made very easy because the developer and I were sitting across the table from each other. So if a decision had to be made, it was kind of like, hey, can we do this? No. Okay. Can we do this? Okay. And that's how kind of seamless it was. And it's what made the project move very smoothly and really within budget. Bathrooms we designed. This is the penthouse. It's a very strange site in that it allows a front to rear. The south face is here, the north face is here, and it's very rare that you get a very shallow site in New York where you can actually have a view through the apartment like that, from front to back. This is inside the dormer, looking south, and that's the building at night. Another example of getting rid of the client. This is a house that I designed for my family. And in this case, so my wife was the client, and I was the client. And in some ways we did this because Jared has a degree in architecture, a master's in architecture, and also a master's degree in construction management. And he spent the first 5 years working as a contractor on some really incredible stuff in New York City. I did not have a lot of hands-on experience, and so when I decided to build this house, and this is in upstate New York, I decided that I would actually act as the general contractor. And so it was kind of it was a way to save money, first of all, because I was the general contractor, and two, it was a chance for me to learn a little bit about construction. Because even though I had practiced for several years, I still hadn't kind of gotten my hands dirty, and in New York City, if you're working in an apartment, it's very different than working on ground-up construction. So this was a project that we built very idealistically. It was a house that my wife and I wanted to use as a clock in a way, to track the time, the development, and the growth of our family. And so the house on several different levels tracks time. It's wrapped in copper. And as we planned the house, we realized that there were some conflicts with the site, which was a very densely wooded site, with where we wanted rooms and where the light was coming from. So a dining room, which we worked through and planned, was in the center of the house, but that didn't really make sense because the sunset light which we wanted to provide light to the room, was on the wrong side. And a bedroom, which we had worked out and planned. See, this is I'm telling you guys all the mistakes we make as architects, right? So, like, we should know how to plan a house, for heck's sake. But when we drew the plan and when I talked with my wife and we went through what we wanted, nothing worked out. One room was here, but it wanted morning light. One room was here, and it wanted evening light, and they were all flipped around. And no matter what we did, and we had a very nice, my wife and I had a very good relationship on designing this house, it still didn't work out. And when we came to the plan, we had to solve it a different way. And that was to solve it by letting light into the house where it needed to have light come into the house. And so on the north side of the house, you end up with a very mute box, copper, which measures time over a much longer scale. And on the south side of the house, we carved the back of the house so that light came into rooms at certain times of day and in certain ways when we wanted it to. So there's a skylight in each of these carves. The center of the house, which is where we wanted the dining room, west is over here, gets a skylight on this face and light comes in this way. The kitchen, where we wanted light in the morning, east is over here, gets morning light through a light shelf in this way. A bedroom for guests who we didn't want to sleep late gets morning light, would come in this way. And so the house's form responded to the needs of the plan and made a shape that was obviously composed, but also responsive to the environment. And so the house tracks time in this way, sunrise to sunset. The light monitors are a clock for the house on a daily scale. And this is what happens. This is the guest bedroom on the west side of the house getting east morning light. This is the section. This is the dining room with a west-facing skylight nearer to the end of the day. The master bedroom, And for New Yorkers to see the sky with stars is something special. So we don't typically see stars unless we've been mugged. The other thing that I learned about that project is as a general contractor, I learned how to deal with what happens when your builders get in nail gun fights. I got a call one day from the local building inspector, and he said, I got a problem. I was 2 hours away. I said, what's the problem? He said, well, I went up to take a look at the house just on a drive-by, and the carpenters were shooting their nail guns at each other, and one guy was bleeding from the knee. So that's the type of stuff you learn when you decide to be your own contractor, how to then address that with your subs. The last project I'm going to show in this kind of section about kind of proactivity is a very large piece of land that Jared's development partner and he acquired in the Hudson Yards. It's an area of New York City at the very north end of Chelsea towards Midtown, where the New York Jets wanted to build a stadium, and the stadium plan fizzled. The Jets built the new stadium out in New Jersey, and now there's a very large plan of redevelopment in the Hudson Yards near the Javits Center. And the plan is for this enormous millions of square feet of office space, which they're now just kind of starting. They agreed to sell or to lease a huge piece of land to a large developer in New York, and it kind of has sat as the economy has struggled. And it's now picking back up. But about 3 years ago, Jared was able to find a piece of land and acquire the rights to that piece of land. And we started on an endeavor to design a very, very tall building. Something, again, that was, no one would ever hire us to do this. And so in this project, we worked with Architecture Research Office. Again, they're good friends of ours. And we collaborated on a design for a skyscraper. This is a photograph by Richard Barnes of starlings in Rome who have these kind of very strange migratory moments where they create these kind of bubbles of thousands of birds, and it's kind of inexplicable. But Richard did a series, and it's kind of served as an inspiration for us as a space in the city where people were going to hopefully migrate to. This is the piece of land. Again, we always end up finding, and I think this is part of Jared's opportunism, is that he finds these pieces of land that are very odd. Right? So that makes it harder. It's why they're available in a way, is because a lot of people don't necessarily know what to do with them. Jared's pretty optimistic and figures that no matter how strange it is, we can figure out what to do with it. And so this is what you end up with in the process. And we went through a real design process on this, having never designed a skyscraper. Again, it was an exercise in trying to figure out who do you talk to, what consultants do you use, how do you deal with real world issues, code, changes from old code to new code because there was a shift over. What engineers do you talk to, and how do you make a real functional 450,000 square foot building when you haven't really done it before? My favorite model is this one, because this is, again, in all these silly towers, which are just rectangles, this one has like a floating mini skyscraper. And that's when you realize that, there's still the element of kind of idealism and optimism in that. And when the engineer came in and just sort of said, I think he just walked in and just sort of kicked it over. Said, not that one. And this is where we ended up. It was kind of an homage to the United Nations in a way. It was a lot that had two party walls. The building was mixed use. It had a hotel, it had office space, and it had condominiums, with amenity spaces kind of segmenting. So there was commercial space, hotel space, condominium space, and each of these separate slices was a programmed lobby for each of those spaces. Patterns of the facade were developed from that photograph. The plan is split, again, a very odd site with a central core in this place. And this is the resultant building. A series of modules on the facade that relate to that migratory pattern, that abstraction. And the center core. Then Jared found out that the next lot over was also available. So that project stopped, and we looked at expanding the lot to the next lot over. There's a new boulevard which is going through the Hudson Yards area, and these lots, so this was the original site here, and this lot was available. So there was an option to purchase that site, and so we stopped designing on that other building and started looking at the bigger site. This one was 1 million square feet. This all sounds so crazy. Actually, it sounds crazy when I'm talking about it. And in this case, it was, again, a look at the zoning code. How do you make an intriguing building out of what are pretty restrictive requirements about street wall alignments and how much facade you can have engage the street? So there's a rule in New York that says you have to have 50% of the street wall aligned, and this is what the pure zoning diagram comes out to. And you see buildings that have this kind of very simple kind of totemic relationship to the street and to form. But if you rearrange that 50%, and there's nothing in the code that says you can't rearrange that 50%, you can replan the building and create a very dynamic kind of structure. So you align it on the left, but then if you want to, you can push it around. That's the Hudson Yards area. This was the size of the building in scale, but this is the Empire State Building. This is a flat elevation of what the planned zoning was in this district. It was on 35th Street or 36th Street, so this is actually just, this wasn't done for height comparisons, this was done actually to show you the context of the city looking towards the east. And then each of these punch-outs frames different views. So another thing to learn is that you can hire a company that puts up a little balloon that has a camera on it, and they'll send it up, and then they'll have the balloon spin around and take pictures. And they do it every 10 feet. So then you can show your prospective buyers what their view is going to be right above the site. So these are actually views taken from the balloons, the balloon that they sent up to look at the views from the site. And so that allowed us to actually push and pull depending on where we wanted to plan views. And that's the resulting piece of architecture. And then really quickly, a project that so this was about 2008. Things were going crazy. We got a project in Williamsburg, again, a manipulation of zoning to look at a low-slung 100,000 square foot building. We went through schematic design on this project. It was a series of voids, again, just an apartment building with a lot of open space. The developer was looking for a lot of social space within this, an enormous lobby with very few people, which was an apt metaphor for what was about to come, which was this. And this is, what happened in 2008 at the end when the financial markets crashed and architectural firms got pummeled. Our firm, because we were working in the development world, got hit. We went from 15 people down to 6 people, and the 6 people that we had weren't that busy even. And so there was a question about how to react to this. And it turns out that what you have to do is you have to kind of find smaller opportunities. There was survival skills. And it was the same kind of proactive energy in finding projects that could sustain us, because almost all our work went away. The project in Williamsburg went away. Those towers, though the land is still Jared's, that project is not happening. There was a hotel we were designing that we had finished construction documents on and was being bid that just got cut off. So a 130,000 square foot hotel in Soho got killed. A house project got put on hold. A wealthy businessman was designing a loft interior, and he decided to wait out the market. So literally within about a month and a half or 2 months, we lost 5 rather sizable projects, and you wonder what the heck you're going to do. So we started sending packages out. We sent a package out to the city of Dallas because we had read about a pavilion that they were building, or a series of pavilions that they were building, and we got a call a few months later from the head of the Dallas Parks Department to design a pavilion. And it was a very small structure. And so there are a couple projects that I'll just show quickly that are this period of kind of reaction to the cataclysm of the economy. We looked at, this was a 700 or 800 square foot pavilion, tiny budget, but we didn't care. It was really about making something interesting, about inventing something. So we looked at beehives. This is the work of Tara Donovan, an amazing artist who does assemblages with styrofoam cups, and these are straws. This is Christo, I believe. Either Christo or Klaus Oldenburger now, I'm embarrassed that I can't remember. A series of oil barrels that were constructed into a wall. So looking at the idea of a park pavilion and the idea of a beehive picnic, and then how to make it. So looking at corrugated metal, and looking at how light passes through a kind of an extruded hexagon, to create a shelter and to control view. And so these were studies done of small assemblages of hexagons, which we had to figure out how to build into a structure. And so it went back to working with some of the fabricators that we had worked with on the building that has the cloud imprinted on it, and working with material suppliers to do something that hadn't been done before. And in this case, what you do is you just simply corrugate metal, and then you lock it together with what's basically a pressure lock. There's a company called Toggle Lock, and if you basically push two pieces of metal together hard enough, they will hold each other. And that becomes a structure that kind of evokes, in this case we were looking at the National Gallery by Mies, a series of interlocking pieces of corrugated metal painted yellow, which create sun shading in certain locations and view to the sky in other locations. And this is what you get. It's a very small structure. We're waiting to hear back from Parks in Dallas about approvals. We're hoping it gets built, but again, it's one of these things where we have CDs done, and now with revenue, with budget cuts and lower revenues, architecture doesn't always get built. We'll know more hopefully within the month. You work for your family again when you can. This is a project for my sister. My favorite space in New York and one of my favorite buildings is the Whitney. And this is the lobby of the Whitney, and it has always been kind of a dream to do something that was like the Whitney. Not feeling any shame at all about referring to other architects or doing what they've done and trying to do it differently. So my sister bought a bodega. She has a wine selling business online, and she wanted to open a store. So she called me and said, will you design it? And I said, of course. And then I found out that I was getting paid in wine, which is fine. It doesn't help you through, I guess it does help you through a recession. So I calculated what my fee would have been, and I think I'm supposed to get about a case of not so, pretty cheap wine a month for it's something like 11 years or something. So my sister is I have a very, very good relationship with all my sisters, and a very close relationship with, this is my younger sister. And, but my younger sister is very, very, like I am, is pretty stubborn. And so there was a good, a few-week process of trying to kind of get her to understand what I wanted to do, and for me to understand what she wouldn't do. So some ideas, and she had no, this was the renovation of a bodega for as little money as was humanly possible to renovate a bodega. And there was really only one solution, because she had to store wine. Again, it's looking for the opportunity in a very, very significantly constrained project. In this case, the ceiling was the opportunity, and that's when it sort of dawned on me that I had a chance to do something that was Whitney-like, or that made me at least engage that space that I love so much. So we looked at doing a ceiling that was made out of kind of purple sequins like grapes, and it seemed like a maintenance nightmare. And my sister, again, she had very particular ideas about what she wanted, and because wine has to be shown a certain way, there's very little you can do with the space itself. In lieu of reinventing the wheel with wine racks, which is a very expensive thing to do because it's all millwork, you can't really reinvent the wine rack. One, because people need to be able to see the wine that they're buying, find it, and also she needs to be able to restock it really easily. So when you say all the stuff that's on the floor that you touch is kind of off the table, that leaves only a couple surfaces to work in, and the ceiling became the prime opportunity. And so what we came up with and what she liked was this series of light fixtures that were evoking this image of kind of a cut grape in a way, quite literally purple, even though the insides of lots of grapes are not purple. It was still a way to kind of connect the image of wine to the shop itself. So we designed this, and then we had to figure out how the hell to make these light fixtures. This was a ceiling treatment. Because she had no money, and I had designed a space that had 48 of these things, we had to be resourceful. And we found a place on the internet that made these hemispheres. It was a place in Illinois that made these hemispheres of spun aluminum, and they would paint them with basically auto body paint, any color you wanted, and we sent them the drawing, and we said, can we have a price? And they sent us back the price, and I was petrified, and I looked at the email, and the price was $130 a fixture. And at that moment, I was so happy. I sent it to my sister, and I think she said, "Can't they do it for 100?" But we talked it through, and I convinced her to do these 48 light fixtures. And her store, she wanted a social store. So she has a kind of a seating area in the center, and she has racks which ring the space, and a chalkboard line, basically just painted chalkboard, that allows her to reprogram each space by varietal. So she wanted total flexibility, which she got just simply by putting a stripe of paint on the wall. And she got a social space that was designed and defined by a kind of hovering set of light fixtures. And she's doing very well, and the store is a very just pleasant place to be. Looked at where you stand and what you see when you look through a window, whether it's a skylight or a window on the wall, and what your posture is and which way you're looking. And so the house became composed around these views. These are the plans of the house. It's about 4,000 square feet. So ground floor with just an open space, a stairwell, bedroom, living room, and then upstairs another bar on top of that. Bedroom, 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 bathroom, very simple boxes. Again, everything is just simple materials and composed views. Fiber cement panel, cedar, and Corten steel. Again, a seemingly random assemblage of windows, but which point to specific places on his piece of land. It's like, I guess, a mini Knowlton front. No column, though. He insisted on no column. He insisted on us getting it as cheaply as possible, but then he insisted on no column. Typical client disconnect. And his photography studio. These are the windows inside. A view of a very specific tree that he wanted. The kitchen and the bathroom. Standing in the shower looking at one thing, sitting in the tub looking at another. And then the last two projects, small things. And I think this is kind of the last part, which is recovery. As the firm tries to kind of pull itself out of what's happened the last couple of years, finding, again, ways to continue to look at architecture in interesting ways and look at building, I guess, with a sense of optimism. And so this is a competition that we did recently for a hotel room in London, basically a 2-week exercise that we did and thought of the Periscope. It's a space on top of a building in London on the Thames, and they wanted the brief called for a hotel room. That's it, just a hotel room, whatever you want to do. Had to be modular and sustainable. And so we felt that the most interesting thing to do, maybe it's a little bit sadistic, I'm not sure, was to create a room that was completely opaque and completely enclosed, only giving you view that was displaced. And so the building became a kind of, we called it the Periscope. And so we looked at periscopes and a bed which looks at a mirror which looks at the city, or about a desk that looks at a mirror that looks at the city. And so this completely hermetic environment gives you a completely different frame of reference for the city of London. It could be produced modularly, and it would sit on the roof of this building clad in white corrugated metal, no windows, or no conventional windows, just views. So standing at the sink, you end up with a view of the Thames, and lying in bed, you end up with a view of the London Eye. And again, these are small things, the ability to complete and produce creative work, even as the actual clientele roster has shrunk. This isn't a client. The last project I'm going to show is I think, kind of a model for future work. And it goes to a little bit about how I think we want our firm to run. This was an invited competition for Syracuse University for a very sustainable, a kind of cutting-edge sustainable house of only about 1,000 square feet. Our firm has never really talked about how we approach sustainability other than just by trying to be smart about it. There are some firms that talk about their sustainable practices. you never really did that. And I think that probably hurt us a little bit, and also is something that we have also tried to avoid. So we're trying to look at how we do work now in this realm. And this is a competition that we're invited to, again, collaborating with Architecture Research Office. We were paired with them because we had a working relationship for a very small house. A competition in the near west side of Syracuse, which is a very, very tough neighborhood, formerly workers' housing. Syracuse has kind of suffered the fate of the Rust Belt, where industry left. The university is still there and is probably the lifeblood of the city. And Mark Robbins, who is actually here at the Wexner Center and at Knowlton, is the dean there and has taken it upon himself and with the university and with local community organizers to try to resuscitate the near west side. And so he ran a competition for 3 houses, 1,000 square feet, hyper-sustainable. And so for us, this was a chance to learn a bit about this type of project. The competition was run in 2008, and it started like the week we lost projects. So the first meeting we showed up and there were like 18 people. There were like 9 people from ARO and there were like 9 people from our office. And it was because we hadn't laid anyone off yet. So both offices threw everybody in the office at this competition. So in the first meeting there were like 18 people in the room, and the second meeting there were like 6. But we got a lot of research done in that first week. And so we looked at ways to build smartly and sustainably. And for us it was about economic sustainability, because sustainability in this case wasn't just about choosing the right materials or saving energy. It was about, because it was for a neighborhood that needed a tremendous amount of help, it was about creating economic viability in a house that in 10 years was going to be still there and still worth something. So we did a ton of studies. As is typical with a collaborative practice, there are a lot of ideas. In this case, there was a very recurrent theme of a simple house, a pitched roof house. And we came early to passive house strategies, which are becoming more and more popular for a great reason, which is that they don't require a lot of technological bells and whistles. It's a hyper-insulated, very thick-walled house with incredibly high air quality, an air exchanger, and uses passive sort of, I guess even circa 1970s ideas about using the sun to help heat the house and an air exchanger to create good quality air. What happens in a collaborative practice is you end up, you do designs and you end up with this, and then you realize that that building looks like Shemp, and it gets thrown out. But this is really the development of the form, a very simple, almost monopoly-like house with the ridgeline pushed. That allowed for southern exposure where we needed it. It allowed for shade where we needed it. Passive house has very stringent requirements for air quality and air infiltration. The 3 main tenets are heat recovery, so you pull the heat back off of the equipment that's running the ventilation of the house. Passive solar and super insulation, so the equivalent energy that can heat this house is that which is used for a hairdryer. And the system is pretty simple. This was our submittal for the competition. It included a solar collector, but it turned out that we didn't need a solar collector. We didn't actually, the house was really, really efficient energy-wise, and it didn't even need what we thought it needed. It had the ultimate air recuperator, which is a great name for something, and a very simple system, which looks kind of crazy. This is in the cellar of the project, and this is the air exchanger. A little bit of numbers. The energy cost of a typical house in Syracuse is $2,400 a year, and the passive house costs about 70% less than that to run, just through super insulation. The walls are 17 inches thick, and the passive technology, if you add the solar, you get to 90% reduction, but the actual cost of that energy is only a difference of about $80 a year. So that's why we ended up not doing the passive solar, or sorry, the solar collectors, was because it was not going to add enough to make it worth its while. You can see most of the energy usage comes from appliance and heating. And since you can reduce that, the house becomes very, very efficient. Going to the economic sustainability, we made a plan where you could partition it. It could be a 1-bedroom with a rental. It could be a 3-bedroom for a family, a 4-bedroom for a family. These were all viable solutions for our plan. You could partition it off so that you could have a separate entry for a renter. And that way the owner was able to subsidize their own home. And so land values and house values in that neighborhood, which were severely depressed, would be subsidizable by rent. A very simple site plan. We created a small cut. We used the excavation to create a berm and then a small depression, which we thought would be flooded to be frozen in the winter for ice skating. Again, it's a tiny, tiny house. Each floor is about 520 square feet. A simple section. You can see the thickness of the walls and then the depth of the insulation. Now there are 3 houses of this competition that are built. This is by a company called Onion Flats in Philadelphia. And then around the corner is a house by Cook plus Fox. So 3 very different houses in a neighborhood which is filled with empty lots. This is now the ad hoc police station. It's a very tough neighborhood. And this is what the resulting house looks like. It's clad in corrugated metal. It ended up costing about $130 a square foot, $140 a square foot, which again blows the neighborhood does not sustain that type of real estate. The houses in this neighborhood are selling for $60,000 or $70,000. But the university felt it very important to build these new prototypes in this neighborhood to bring people there. And it's going to be a slow process, but I think that, again, it's a very idealistic endeavor that Mark undertook. And it's working so far. The houses are all sold, and the owners who live there are thrilled with it. One works at the university, and one is just in real estate, and they adore it. They want to build another one next door. And these are the interiors. This was the competition entry, and this is the reality. The amount of glazing is prescribed by Passive House. You have a certain amount that you can't exceed. Windows on the wrong walls are forbidden. So if you put a window in, it has to be very small. They end up framing views nicely. That's that window. That's the rendering, and that's the resultant. And this was one of the images from the competition, and I think it's, again, as we talk about recovery, and I'm not sure if any neighborhood would be good with 50 of these houses that we designed. I don't know if that would be the right solution, but for us it was this kind of optimism about what we could do with architecture and how a small building, even though we had done very large things, how a small building might make an impact. And I think that that is something that, based on the course of the last couple of years, is more of a model for us now, is that architecture might have to be small in scale, but also grand in ambition. So thank you.